Hey guys, I'm getting really hairy because I have not gotten a haircut in a while, but I'm walking around outside, kind of wanted to talk about some more stuff. Um, I wanted to talk today about how I think, a lot of the criticisms of the internet in terms of how the internet has impacted the sort of way that we treat other people, particularly in relation to politics, which is one of those more, inflammatory things out there, one of those more inflammatory topics. I just wanted to make some points. I think that, the common framing of it is that when you are on the internet, you have a screen between you and the other person, so you don't really, so it's not the same as being in person. But I kind of wanted to go more in depth because I think it's not really said enough, like what specifically kind of the differences are. Growing up, like whenever we said things that were hurtful, whenever you say hurtful things, you can see it in person. In person, if you say in person something to someone that hurts them, oftentimes you can see it. It's not always, right? Not always. Like, don't get me wrong. There are circumstances where, people are good at hiding it and you don't see, that they've been hurt by what you said. But a lot of the times you can see it. You can see it in their reaction. You can see it in their body language. You can see it in what they say and do afterwards. And a lot of times, like, that does, for most humans, evoke a kind of, sympathetic, apologetic response. And I think one of the biggest things that has caused the internet to sort of, perpetuate so much vitriol between people, between humans, right? So much just anger and hatred, right? Sometimes over valid things, but oftentimes over not valid things, at least relative to what we actually say, like the hurtful things we say online. It just seems like a lot of times people, those things, they don't, how do I put this into words? I think a lot of times those things that we say, when they're said over a screen, you don't see all that. You don't necessarily see the reaction. You don't necessarily see, you log into your phone or your computer, whatever you're using. You go into Instagram and you comment with something that you would probably never say if the person was standing right in front of you. And, you respond and then you go about your day. And there really isn't, I think, any consequences to what you say. And when people hear consequences, they often think punishment, and I don't mean punishment. By consequences, I mean there's no really, follow-up, right? When you say something to someone in person, there often is a follow-up where you are hearing a response from them right in that moment, or you are seeing a response. You're seeing their brain actually process what you just said, right? And you don't always notice that. You don't always think about it, but we all do. We all, especially for me, someone with social anxiety disorder, I think that this is the part of my brain that is more hyperactive, right? Most people, from my understanding, I could totally be wrong in this, most people, they don't have anxiety whenever they're interacting with just anybody because they're not constant, they briefly kind of register what the reactions of the people who are hearing what they're saying are, and then they go on about it. And for me, a lot of my life, I've had to work on the fact that for me, anytime I said something and someone responded, I would notice very minor details, and my mind would kind of fixate on them. And I still do this. I still have this issue. When you're online, when you're on Instagram, because Instagram is, if you think Facebook is bad, Instagram is a cesspool. Instagram comment sections are disgusting sometimes, but when you're on Instagram and you're in those comment sections, you often are just typing out something that comes to your mind. You're not really thinking about those consequences, about the follow-up. You're not thinking about what the follow-up is going to look like, because as far as you're concerned, you can deal with the follow-up at any time. You don't have to deal with the follow-up right now. You can push it off. I know me personally, I've seen in my notifications that someone has responded to a comment that I made on Instagram, and I know, it's embarrassing. I really shouldn't engage in arguments in Instagram comment sections with people, but trust me, it is addictive. I see those response notifications, and I just kind of am like, I'm not going to open it now. I'll just open it later when I'm in a better mind space. And, there's a benefit to that. The benefit is that, you kind of are able to conserve your own mental health. But the trade-off is that whenever you're talking to people online, I think you're never really in the mind space that you're in when you're talking to people in person. You just aren't. I think it's completely different. I think there's a completely different dynamic. And I think this is especially the case when it comes to strangers versus people you know. When it's people you know, you can tell, right? Either, firstly, right? If it's someone you know, you probably value not hurting them, right? When we're talking about a complete stranger who you have never met in person and have very little relation to, it's very easy to really not have a problem with hurting them, especially if you don't have to witness the follow-up, the consequences of your words, right? On Instagram, you very rarely have to witness the follow-up. You very rarely have to, you might get an angry comment back, but that's not oftentimes, mentally, the kind of follow-up that evokes that caution in us, right? People being pissy towards us and saying nasty things to us, I think 90% of the time, it angers us. It evokes more of a, respond back to them, right, than something like, yeah, maybe my words there were not right, When people say nasty things to me on Discord, I have more of an urge to respond back and, counter that than I do to, kind of do a double take and be like, why did the follow-up look like that, And I know I'm probably sounding low-key, a little cringe with this whole, follow-up and consequences language, but I genuinely think that looking at our interactions this way, I think it's just something that psychologically and sociologically kind of, I think, helps us understand why the way we behave online says a lot about us as people. Because if we truly value, being decent, if we truly value being kind individuals, we're kind online as well. Because again, we don't have the consequences there. And if you're only kind because of the consequences, I think that is a massive sign to you that there needs to be improvement there, right? I'm not gonna, go all ape shit. I'm not gonna say you're automatically a horrible person, because I know that everybody does this. But I think it's very much a sign for you if you find yourself, talking to people online in a way that you just find so much more vitriolic and so much more ruthless than the way you talk to people in person. I had somebody come up to me in person and apologize for the way that he's been, talking to me online. And this guy was not even saying anything that particularly hurt me. The only slightly passive aggressive thing I remember him saying was when he was talking about the genocide happening in Gaza, and he was like, how can you not view it as a genocide? Because this was like months and months and months ago, when it was like much earlier, and I didn't really see it as much of a genocide as like what's happening in the West Bank, where they're actively trying to replace the population there. You know, this was back when I considered Gaza to be more of like just an instance of like mass killing, rather than explicitly having the intentions that genocide usually entails terminologically. So, you know, he responded, and he kind of didn't really seem to understand how I could think that. And so in the moment, he said, like, how can you not think it's genocide? But that is like so fucking tame. Like, maybe it shouldn't be, right? Maybe things like that should be considered like the most vitriolic people will get. But that was barely even vitriol. That was barely even anything that like upset me or really did anything. You know, because I already knew that people were very adamant about the fact that they have thought for a long time that what's happening in Gaza is genocide, ever since it began, you know. So yeah, I think that, you know, he apologized to me, but I think something that I'm noticing now, or just like at least kind of acknowledging, is like he did it in person. And I think a big part of that, maybe not, you know, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I think it was kind of important, at least, that he did it in person, because I think it allowed him to have that follow-up, right? It allowed him to really think through his words, so he wasn't, you know, saying, you know, giving his apology, but then kind of being passive-aggressive alongside it, you know? And like, to some extent, yeah, I think that was like something I could really respect. Obviously, I don't know if that was intentional. It probably wasn't. He probably was not looking at it that way. But like, nonetheless, it is something I noticed, because I think that it's just kind of telling that he chose to do it in person, because it allowed him to be more authentic with it, to not just be thinking in terms of this is a character on a computer screen, and to be thinking more in terms of this is a person. That's a big part of it. I think when we argue with people online, we don't really see as much of the humanity in them. We kind of just see them as like political opponents, especially when it comes to politics. When I argue with people online, like, sometimes I find myself kind of like, especially when I was younger. Now I feel like I've kind of improved with, like, you know, kind of honing in the values of just like being behaviorally a good person. But like, back when I was younger, like, I think I definitely was treating a lot of internet conversations as kind of like the, you know, the gridiron, like, and like, that's just not healthy for anyone else, but it's also, like, more importantly, it's not healthy for you, right? I don't think anyone enjoys going online and arguing with people and getting treated like shit and treating other people like shit. I don't think anyone enjoys that. You know, do I think the things I'm talking about in this video are ever going to change? Completely, probably not. You know, there's always going to be vitriol, but I think what definitely can change is I think we can have more people out there who, when they see vitriol online and when they, you know, when they experience or witness, you know, bad behavior, they don't consider it an okay thing. They consider it what it is, a bad thing, and they don't just brush it off, you know? We're obviously never going to be able to eradicate bad behavior, but I think we can sort of, you know, how humans have been doing for a long time, we can push the incentives in a positive direction, and we can make it so that more and more people are going to be decent people, even in settings where it's very easy not to be, you know? I realize this video probably sounds like some kind of juvenile PSA, but I suppose in the modern world, that's kind of just the reality of what we live in. You know, we have to be reminded of these very basic things because nothing really feels like it's being followed anymore. It feels like everybody is just fighting a war, and it doesn't matter how far we take that war as long as we win. And I have a really big problem with that because I'm a huge history nerd, and a lot of my life has been invested in hearing about events throughout history where this kind of behavior has caused a lot of people to die and a lot of people to get hurt, you know. The French Revolution is the example I like to bring up the most, just because, you know, they revolted. They took down their dictatorial king, right? They got rid of him. They established a more democratic system. But then, you know, what ended up happening is that democracy wasn't enough to fix all that. And like here in America, we always talk about how we want to defend democracy, but we don't talk about how it isn't enough. You know, you can't just have a democratic system of governance. You also have to convince people of the right way to utilize that democracy. You know, you have to convince people that, like, you know, you can have a democracy, but if you treat others immensely poorly, that democracy, like, what purpose does it serve? It just serves to exacerbate the problems of civilization. And I think that especially today, like with what we see with President Trump, I think not enough people are realizing that the current state of the Republican and Democratic parties are, at least in part, a reflection of what we haven't focused enough on, you know? Like, I'm not about to tell socialists they haven't focused on their values enough, because that is obviously not true. If you have ever met a socialist, you know that's not true. But, you know, like, people are very, very upset with the two-party system a lot of the time, but they never really focus on, you know, really getting to the root of it, and tackling it, right? They're shocked that Trump rose in this kind of environment, but like, they're shocked that Trump is the president of the United States, but they don't acknowledge how this kind of environment where there's so much vitriol, where people are so just awful, where you have members of Congress who are now, like, not really having any issue with calling their opponents just straight up evil, right? You know, you're seeing an increase in all this just vitriolic, awful behavior, and everybody's wondering how in such an environment, in such a vitriolic environment, they're surprised as to how Trump can, like in that kind of environment, that's ripe for someone like Trump to come to power, right? I keep hearing this slogan, you know, like, hate cannot beat love. And it's like, yes, but you can't out-hate hate. You can't, you know, you can't beat people like Trump at their own game. I mean, it's part of why Hillary lost. You know, watching those presidential debates, it sounded like she was trying to, like, kind of sound like the Democratic version of Donald. It sounded like she was trying to, like, you know, really, like, beat him at this, you know, big, tough, you know, strong on American policies kind of caricature. But people just ended up not voting for her. You know, the progressives who had voted for Bernie felt completely cheated because, I mean, low key in 2016 and 2020, they kind of were, like, you know, I know, like, oftentimes this can sound very conspiratorial, but I do think the way in which pretty much everybody ganged up on Bernie was just inherently unfair and very sketchy, in my opinion, you know? I mean, especially in 2020, like, they had a bunch of candidates out there that were, like, literally just airing grievances and calling Bernie's campaign sexist and shit. And then, surprise, surprise, a lot of them ended up endorsing Joe Biden. You know, I guess I just, you know, people always act so surprised, but I really do have to tell people, like, I think this is very unsurprising. I think where we are is very much where I would expect a country that has, you know, gone about politics and just talking to one another in the way that we have. I think this is very much where I would expect us to be. You know, there's always going to be surprising world events, but the broader picture, you know, the broader themes of the last few years, it's just so unsurprising. You know, it's just so unsurprising, because this is, like, when you think about it from a sociological standpoint, it makes 100% sense. And I kind of do want to ask, my sociology professor from community college, like, you may have, like I knew he's very liberal. Like, that was abundantly obvious. But, like, I kind of want to ask him, like, do you think where we are, given the variables that America has been given, do you think it's surprising from a sociological standpoint? Because I think he might answer no. I think, honestly, he might agree with me and might say, you know what, it's awful. I think it's awful personally, but this makes a lot of sense in terms of where we are. It makes a lot of sense that we have a lot of this behavior, and, frankly, we have to address it. I wouldn't be surprised if he said that, so yeah. So that's about it for my tangent for today. Yeah.